Hi, my name is Michelle from Have Fork Will Travel, and I'm here for the Fresno County's Valentine Tapas for Two, or Small Plates to Share with the One You Love video series. So far we have made a few appetizers, and we've made a few delicious main dishes, so now we're on to dessert. We're going to make some heart sugar cookies, and then after that we're going to do some chocolate covered cheesecake bites. We're going to start with the cookies. They go pretty quickly. They're really easy to do, but they're very delicious. So we have some shortening. I'm using a butter flavored Crisco. You can use margarine or butter. If you're going to use anything other than shortening, I would recommend butter. It has a less water content than margarine, and it will turn out to have a more tender cookie. We have sugar, vanilla, 1 egg, some salt, baking powder, and flour. So first off, we're going to cream the shortening along with the egg and sugar. And once that gets incorporated, then we will add in the dry goods. So first off, we're going to cream this, and it's going to get very loud. I'll warn you now. Till it's a little bit light and fluffy, and then we're going to add in the rest of the ingredients. And you're going to want to add the sugar a little bit at a time and make sure that you scrape the sides of the bowl down periodically. So you need to scrape the sides of the bowl down every now and then to make sure that you incorporate all of the sugar and shortening or butter together. Otherwise you're going to have clumpy mess on the side, and you're just going to push it down towards the middle and make sure that anything on the bottom is mixed in as well. And the easy way to do that is use a soft-sided spoon, so you can just scrape it on the mixer and everything drops back in. That goes really quickly, and see how light and fluffy that is? You want it light so that way the cookies stay tender instead of being tough. So after that, we're going to add in the vanilla, the salt, and even in a sweet dish you need salt. It helps balance out the flavor and makes the cookie actually sweeter. Baking soda. And if you're able to sift everything ahead of time, I would recommend doing so, but if not, just make sure that you mix it really well. So the flour we're going to add in a little bit at a time, like the sugar, for two reasons. One, to make sure that you don't have an explosion of flour when you turn on the mixer, and two, that way you can judge based on the texture of the cookie whether you need more flour or actually a little bit less. And always start on low, or you're going to wind up wearing flour and it's going everywhere. And turn your bowl to get all of the sides. And we've went around one time. And then we're going to pause and scrape the bowl down again. And it seems like kind of a silly step. If you don't have a mixer and you're doing this by hand, just make sure that you get the sides as well to get the flour and sugar and baking powder off the sides. That's not something you want in a cookie, is a clump of dried flour. It's not very pleasant. So we're almost done. I have a little bit more flour to add in. And always turn your mixer off beforehand. Again, otherwise you're going to have an explosion of flour and wear it. All right, so everything's incorporated. There's the oven. You're going to want to preheat your oven if at all possible when you're baking. In this case, we are sped up the process a little bit, so I have a batch of dough ready to go, so that way we can show you how it turns out a little bit. So for the beaters, you're going to want to make sure that you scrape them well. Do not eat the dough raw. It has egg in it. Once it's cooked, it will be fine, but raw egg is not recommended to be eaten. It's just safer that way. If you want to make the cookie dough without the egg to snack on or mix in other things, you can do so, but leave the egg out of it. All right, so there's 1 and 2. And if you are so inclined, you can use your fingers instead of using a spatula to get the dough out of the beaters. So let me grab another bowl real quick and we will go on to the next step. So we need to get another bowl out. We are going to be taking the cookie dough, and as you can see, the texture is fairly stiff. We're going to split the dough into 2 pieces so that way we can add in the red food coloring. It's Valentine's Day. We're making red and white sugar cookies because I don't want red fingers, and food dye is a thing. We're going to take half of the dough and put it over in a separate bowl. Don't use a plastic bowl if you're using food dye because it will turn the bowl pink. So we have about half per bowl, and I'm going to take probably about a teaspoon of red food dye and just scrape it all in there. This is one of those personal preference. If you want more of a light pink, you can use less food dye. If you want a darker red, you can use more. And you're just going to mix it in there. You don't want any streaks. If it seems like the dough is a little soft, you can always add in a little bit more flour, not too much. I wouldn't go more than probably a teaspoon at a time because the dough will hydrate a little bit when you put it in the refrigerator. So let me get this mixed up. And it goes pretty quick. If you prefer natural food dyes, you could probably add in maybe some powdered beetroot. But again, keep in mind that is a powder, so that will affect the flour and moisture ratio a little bit. All right, so it's actually pretty good, but I'm going to add in just a smidge. By smidge, I'm meaning about a half a teaspoon to a teaspoon of flour, not more than that. If you add too much flour, the cookies are going to be too dry and difficult to work with when you roll them out, and they're going to be super crumbly when you bake them. If you don't have enough flour in it, the cookie will spread and not hold its shape when you bake it. And part of baking, especially for things like this, is the moisture in the air, your oven, etc. But sugar cookies are fairly forgiving. And now we have pink cookie dough. So in this one we have, let's take this off so that way I don't have pink in both. We have regular beige or white cookie dough, and we have red. You're going to want to take both of them and take a plastic bag or plastic wrap and put it in the bag. Put it in the fridge for at least an hour. That way the cookie can set up a little bit and make it easier to roll out. Part of using butter or shortening is the dough gets very stiff in the fridge, so you can manipulate it, roll it out, cut it into shapes. If you tried to do it now, it would just spread and you wouldn't be able to make shapes with it very easily. You'd have to use even more flour, and that would not turn out very well. So we have both these ready to go in the freezer, or actually the refrigerator. We're going to put them in for an hour. Give me just a moment. We'll pull out the dough that I made a little while ago and we will make cookies. So the cookie dough has been sitting in the fridge for 1 to 2 hours, and it's time to make our cookies. We have the red dough and white dough, and then some sugar to sprinkle on it when you're done. You're going to take a piece of dough about the size of a walnut and roll it out into a thin ribbon. And if it's not perfect, that's okay. Take red, again about the size of a walnut, and roll it out. And if it falls apart, just push it back together. Sugar cookies are pretty forgiving. And now what you're going to do is you're going to take the dough and twist it together. And then from there, make a heart shape as best you can. Again, it doesn't have to be perfect. And sometimes you have to mess with it a little bit or play with it to get it in the right shape. And put it on the cookie sheet. In this case, I've used parchment paper because it makes it easier for cleanup afterwards. These cookies are really fun to do. Just take your time. If you want, you could also you roll it thin and just do cutouts instead. But we are doing twisted hearts. So once we get them all rolled out, we'll cover them with the pink sugar and bake it, and they will be just delicious. So we're doing the second cookie. And this is something you could do ahead of time, maybe a day or two. Part of the series is most of it you can do a day ahead of time. You don't have to do it all the day of. If you make a little bit too little to make a heart, like in this case, just pinch off a little bit more. It doesn't take much. Roll it out. And if you notice, because the cookie dough has sat in the fridge, the red food dye is not coloring my hands red, but it did color the cookie dough. So we pinch that together and just wind it. If you happen to have a small, very thin spatula, you could use that to pick the cookie up to put it onto the cookie sheet. But you can also just use your hands. Just be very careful. These are kind of fragile until they bake. And they could be different sizes. That's part of the fun. You're showing how much you love someone by making them a delicious treat. So let me get a few more of these done. We'll throw them in the oven. We'll show you what it looks like before they go in. And then we'll wait for 10 minutes. Alright, so we have our pan of cookies ready to go in the oven. One thing I forgot to mention is if the cookie dough is sticking a little bit too much to roll out easily, just put a light dusting of flour on your surface. The cookies will absorb a little bit, but not so much that they become tough, and it will make it easier to roll without it sticking to your hands or the table or workspace. So we have these ready to go in. We're going to put them in a 350-degree oven for about 10 to 15 minutes. And then we'll pull them out. But first we're going to take some of our colored sugar. And it's not really going to impart much color to it, just a little bit of sparkle. And a little bit of texture when it's baking. And you can use as little or as much as you like. If you have some other type of sprinklings or sugar candies to put on top, now's the time to do it. Alright, and these are ready to go in, so give me about 10 to 15 minutes and we will be back. That was the longest 15 minutes that you can imagine. So the kitchen smells wonderful from the baked cookies, and as you can see, they turned out just wonderfully. So because parchment paper is very slippery and the cookies are extremely hot, you let them sit for just a moment to set. and then very carefully slide that onto a heat resistant surface so they can cool off. Sugar cookies, especially when you pull them out of the oven, are very fragile, and you need to let the sugar and the baked goods just cool off so everything can set in the shape. If you try and pick it up too early, it's going to break, and then you're going to have cookie crumbles instead of whole cookies. So we're going to let these cool off. We're not going to mess with them anymore. While we're waiting for them to cool, we're going to pull out what we need for the chocolate covered cheesecake bites, and we'll get started with that. So our cookies are cooling, and we're going to get started on the chocolate covered cheesecake bites. Now the thing with this dessert is you definitely want to start it the day before because it needs to chill in the freezer for a few hours to overnight. So we're going to get started with the crust, which is really easy. It's just crushed graham cracker crumbs. If you have vanilla wafers or some other type of crisp cookie, you can use that as well. If you want to make it a little bit sweet and salty, you can throw in a couple of, like half a handful of pretzels, just to add a little bit of extra flavor in there. So we're going to start and add most of these in. And you can use a food processor to make the crumbs, or put everything in a plastic bag and very carefully use a rolling pin or a heavy pan to crush them. If you have small children, this is perfect for them. Just supervise them to make sure they don't get a little bit carried away, because if a bag breaks, it goes everywhere. So from that, we are going to add in some softened butter. And we're going to start with half a cube, maybe a little more. The idea is you want the butter to hold everything together. It creates kind of a glue. We have some brown sugar. And the best part about this crust is, and actually the cheesecake itself, this is a little bit of salt, is it is no bake. So everything is going to be done on the counter, and then you put it into the freezer and it does most of the work for you. So you could use melted butter if you like, but you have to be a little bit more careful on the mixing. Otherwise you wind up with a puddle of butter on one side of the bowl and not a lot of crust components on the other. The idea is you want this to wind up to be like wet sand. So you're going to work the butter through, and you could do this in a food processor as well. It would work really well in that. I'm kind of a hands-on person, so this is how I like to do things. It's also easier for me to gauge that I have enough butter, or if I would need a little bit more of the breadcrumbs or cookie crumbs, depending what you're using. You can use breadcrumbs if you want to do a savory cheesecake. I prefer sweet cheesecakes, but that's just me. So it looks like it's sticking together pretty well, but I'm going to add a little bit more butter, probably the rest of the cube. Needs a little bit more. Add a little bit extra of the cookie crumbs or graham cracker crumbs because I want a thicker crust. And again, that's personal preference. I've done this before where the crust is really thin, but I like the cookie portion of it just as much as the cheesecake, so that's why I'm making it a little bit thicker today. And you're just going to squish it together and mix it all in. You don't want any lumps of butter that are not incorporated, because that wouldn't be pleasant to bite into either when you're eating your cheesecake bites. All right, so everything is mixed together really well, and it will hold its shape when you press it together, just like wet sand. And the easiest way to form this is to just dump it into the pan. We have a 9-inch pan that I have 2 pieces of parchment paper cut to fit. The idea for that is so that it is easier to pull out once the cheesecake is set. So I'm just going to dump the whole thing in. And again, I like a little bit more of the cookie crust in there. So, and as you can see, there's a piece of pretzel because I like sweet and salty. And you don't have to make it with any pretzel bits. It's up to you. I like a little bit of flavor difference in mine, so that's why I chose to add that in. If you wanted to make a chocolate crust, you could do so as well. You would add in a couple tablespoons to a quarter cup of cocoa powder and probably a couple more tablespoons of sugar in there because cocoa powder is bitter by itself. It does need the sugar in order to taste like the chocolate we all know and love. All right, so this is pressed down. You want to make sure that it is even as possible. So we're going to be freezing it and then layering the cheesecake mix on top and then cutting it and dipping it in chocolate. So that just took a couple of minutes. It's all set to go. We're going to put it into the freezer for about 15 minutes to let everything set. While it is freezing, we're going to make the cheesecake filling and smooth it on top, and then it goes in the freezer for about 2 to 4 hours, preferably overnight. That way everything sets and is ready to go. So let's put this in the freezer and we will get the filling made and ready to put in. So for the filling, it's really simple. All it is cream cheese, vanilla, and some powdered sugar or confection sugar. So you want to start off with 1 block of softened cream cheese. Cold cream cheese will not whip properly and you'll get lumps and grainy texture, and that's not good for anybody. So it's going to get a little noisy, but that's the way it goes. So we're going to take it and start whipping it and add in the vanilla. And the idea is you want it smooth before you start adding in the confection sugar. If it's a little thick, you can add in a little bit of heavy or whipping cream, but very little. You just want it smooth, not enough to make it soupy. Okay, you want to stop periodically, similar to the cookies, and scrape the sides down. Again, so that way everything is incorporated and you don't have any stray lumps of cream cheese, or when we get to adding the sugar in just a moment, any dry bits of sugar that are not mixed in. This is what is going to go into the filling or the pie shell we just made. And also similar to with the cookies, you're going to add in a little bit at a time, so that way you don't have an explosion of powdered sugar all over the place. So I put about 1/2 to 2/3 of the sugar in, and you turn it on low. And you'll see that the consistency is similar to frosting. We're going to take it a little bit thicker, put in a little bit more of the powdered sugar. The reason being is so when it freezes, it's going to set thick enough so that you can dip it in the chocolate without it being melty, but still soft enough that you can bite into it without it being too hard. Alright, so it's almost the right consistency because we still want to be able to spread it, but I'm going to add in the last little bit of powdered sugar. It's about 1.5 cups for 1 block of cream cheese. It's nice and smooth. Let me take this out here. So I've grabbed the pie shell because cheesecake is a type of pie. And we're going to clean off the beaters. Now you could lick this because there is no egg in it. So if you want to have a little snack for yourself, feel free to. All right, so at this point we have our frozen base. We're just going to scoop it all in. Try to distribute it a little bit while you are pouring it in. That way it'd make it easier for smoothing it out shortly. And it's a little on the thick side, but that's okay. You want it that way it will freeze in a timely manner and will hold together when you put the melted chocolate over the top of it. If you wanted to, you could use a smaller pan with higher sides, but keep in mind, the deeper it is, the longer it's going to take to freeze. All right. All right, so let me grab this. We're going to use an offset spatula and just smooth it gently. And the idea is you're pushing from the center of the pan to the outside and trying to make sure that all of the crust is covered and enclosed in the cheesecake. And if a few crumbs creep through, that's fine. You're going to be covering it in chocolate anyways, so it's not a big deal. All right, so last little corner here. And the idea is to make it as smooth as possible so that way all the pieces are about the same thickness. All right, one last little push here. As you can see, we have a few crumbs poking through, but that's okay. If you had some extra graham cracker crumbs, you could even sprinkle them on top before you freeze it. So give a little bit of extra texture and flavor. All right, so that's all there is to it. Real simple, just takes a few minutes. We're going to put it in the fridge for about 2 to 4 hours or overnight. And then we're going to pull it out. Once it's set solid, cut it into pieces and dip it in chocolate. So let's get this frozen and we'll go from there. So it's been a few hours and I've pulled the frozen cheesecake out of the freezer. Before we dip it, we need to melt the chocolate. So we have about 2 cups of chocolate chips and a couple tablespoons of coconut oil. I'm going to add the coconut oil to the chocolate chips and melt them in the microwave on high heat for 20-second intervals, stirring every time. Don't start it in the microwave and walk away. Chocolate can go from solid state to burning very rapidly, but it shouldn't take more than a minute or 2 at best. But do it in 20-second intervals so you can control the rate of melting. So let's get this melted, then we'll be ready to dip and go. The chocolate is melted. It took about a minute, 20 seconds in a 700-watt microwave, and it's not super loose, but it's not too thick. So this has been sitting for a minute. We're going to take it out of the pan, and you're going to want to set it on a cutting board or another object that is pretty firm. Cutting board works really well, and you're just going to take a knife, cut straight down, and the idea is to make 1-inch cuts. If you have a really big pizza cutter, this would be a great time to use it. And you will also get sticky, so plan ahead. And this isn't perfect, but that's okay. And we'll do part of this now, and then we'll do the other part. That way we can get some of this cheesecake setting in the chocolate. So if you can see the edge, there's a little bit of cookie with the cheesecake. So we're going to cut squares. Now you could eat it just like this. You could put it in a bowl and pour some syrup over top, or some fresh strawberries, caramel sauce, or whipped cream. Even just some chocolate sprinkles in it would be really delicious like that, but we're going to make it a little bit special and dip it in chocolate. All right, so you're going to take a piece. Well, let's get this first one here. The corner is always the most difficult, no matter what you're fixing. And just dip it, shake it off. If you don't have one of these, you can use a large fork. The idea is to coat it. In this case, the corner is being difficult, so that's okay. And you have to move or work a little quickly because it will start softening. Think of it similar to ice cream. So you have a piece, and put it on the parchment paper. And again, it doesn't have to be perfect, but you do want to try to coat it as much as possible. And shake off the excess, and then transfer it to the paper. And you could probably do a couple at a time, but it would be harder to control when you're dumping it onto the, or placing it on the parchment paper and shaking off the extra chocolate. And if you get a little bit extra squiggles around, that's fine too. You're going to be putting this back in the freezer to harden the chocolate, and that should go in probably at least an hour. So this would definitely be something to do the day before or 2 days before. And it goes pretty quick, and if you have a little bit like that, you just touch it up a little bit with the edge of the fork, or you can take a spoon with any extra chocolate that's left over and just do a little swirl on top. All right, so we have this started. Let me finish the rest of this tray so we can get it in the freezer, and we'll go from there. So because this is a frozen cheesecake and not baked, think of it like ice cream. So when it's sitting outside in the kitchen for a little bit of time, it's going to start getting soft and melting, as the top of this is. So I've done half of the pan. I'm going to put this back in the freezer for about a half hour, 45 minutes, pull it back out and finish the rest of it. But in the meantime, this is going into the freezer to set as well. So if you can only have space to do part of it at a time, then do part of it, do half a pan, put it back in the freezer, put these in, and you can serve these for Valentine's Day. And then you have this to serve as a different way with frozen strawberries and whipped cream on top. Treat it like a regular cheesecake. Just remember that if you want to dip it in chocolate, you're going to need to reheat the chocolate chips again 20 seconds at a time before you dip the cheesecake in, but it does need to be solid. It's only been out of the refrigerator or the freezer for about 10 minutes, and it's already getting a little soft because it's not coated in chocolate. So let me put this in the freezer, put this in the freezer as well, and we will start on the drinks. So this is the adult part of the video. You must be 21 or older to make these drinks. So we're going to make an Earl Grey martini. and an espresso martini. And I think we're going to start off with the espresso martini first. Well, actually, we're going to start off with the Earl Grey first because I've wanted to try a little bit of that all day. So we have 3 ounces of gin that I've steeped an ounce or a teaspoon of Earl Grey tea for 2 hours. We have 1.5 ounces of lemon juice, a teaspoon of sugar, and then we're going to put in some ice cubes. Let that sit for just a moment. In the meantime, we will take our glass. Yes, I know it is not a martini glass, but at this point of the evening, it doesn't matter. And we're going to rim it with some sugar and set it off to the side. All right, so I'm going to put the lid on. Make sure that you hold on to the top of it when you do, otherwise it's going to go flying. And you're just going to shake it up. You want to make sure that everything gets nice and cold. Strain it. Okay. And then just accent it with a lemon wheel. And there you have a real simple Earl Grey martini. Let me get this rinsed out and we will make the espresso martini. So as much as I want to try the Earl Grey martini, we're going to make the espresso martini. So for that you need about 1.5 ounces of vodka, 1 ounce of fresh brewed espresso. If you don't have espresso powder, you can always use instant coffee. It only takes about 1/4 to 1/2 teaspoon per 1 ounce of water. Just make sure the water is hot. When you add it, let it cool down before you put it in the drink. And then we have 3/4 ounce of Kahlua. All right, we're going to put in a little bit more ice. And make sure the top's on. Shake it up. And pour it into the glass. And we're going to top it with a little bit of shaved chocolate. This happens to be from a local chocolatier in Fresno. And there you have it. 2 very simple but equally delicious drinks for Valentine's Day with your sweetie. I'm going to try one. Oh, that's really good, and that would go great with the cheesecake. And this is the Earl Grey martini. Oh, that's really good too. Well, I think these are going to be on regular rotation at our house. They're really good. So give me just a moment. We're going to plate the desserts with the drinks, and you can see what the end of a delicious day with your Valentine tapas for 2 dinner is. So here are the desserts. As you can see, the cookies turned out really nice. Nice, beautiful. Gotta eat one. I love a good sugar cookie. And I have to try the cheesecake bites. See? They're really good. They're soft without being too hard. Their crust or the graham cracker crumb crust inside is delicate, a little crumbly, and then the chocolate on top is perfect. You'll need to store these in the freezer. I don't think they're going to last you more than a couple of days because you'll eat them all. They're so good. Welcome to the Valentine's dinner. I hope you enjoyed it. Please check out the other sections of the appetizer and entree. And remember, life is too short for bad food. You can find all the recipes on www.forktravel.com. Have a good evening.